Joining the team.
No, not quite. Going
We'd
back.
like to present our newest candidate.
No, going back to the old National Press Theatre tradition where the moderator sits to the side of the... hello and welcome to this press conference. I'm Elizabeth Thompson with CBC News. Bonjour et bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. With us today we have Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, Housing Minister Sean Fraser, Minister of Workforce Development, Employment and Official Languages, sorry, mixed the order of that, Randy Boissonnault, and the Minister of Rural Economic Development, Gudie Hutchings, who will be giving us an update on their economic plan. Ms. Freeland?
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So before we dive... Is something wrong? Okay, let me start again. Good morning, everyone. Before we dive into today's announcement, I'd just like to take a moment to highlight Friday's strong job numbers. Thanks to the hard work of Canadians and Canadian businesses, Canada gained 37,000 new jobs in January. That was double market expectations. Unemployment fell to 5.7%. And wages have now outpaced inflation for the past 12 months. Among women, wages increased by 6.2% in January. Today, 1.1 million more Canadians are working compared to before the pandemic. Our government's economic plan is about building a brighter future for everyone. And that absolutely includes Canadians who live in small towns and rural communities. Today, we're going to be talking about specific action our government is taking to make life more affordable for Canadians in rural communities, including by building more houses and improving access to healthcare by attracting healthcare workers to those communities. Sean is going to talk about new measures to increase housing supply in small and rural communities. Then we'll turn it over to Randy, who's going to talk about the work our government is doing to ensure rural Canadians have better access to doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners. And then we're going to hear from our colleague, Gudie. Housing is at the heart of our government's economic plan, and we know that supply is at the heart of Canada's housing challenge. That's why our government is focused on taking real, concrete action day after day, week after week, to build more homes across the country faster. Nous débloquons des milliards de dollars en nouveaux fonds pour le logement, dont un financement supplémentaire à faible coût de 40 milliards de dollars dans le cadre du programme du prêt pour la construction d'appartements. Ce financement permettra de construire plus de 100 000 logements locatifs supplémentaires pour la population canadienne. Nous supprimons la TPS sur les nouvelles constructions locatives afin d'éliminer les obstacles à la construction. Nous sévissons contre l'achat de logements canadiens par des étrangères et des étrangers. Nous sévissons également contre les locations à court terme. Celles-ci empêchent des dizaines de milliers de logements d'être mis sur le marché, en particulier dans les villes comme Toronto, Vancouver et Montréal, où le problème du logement est le plus grave. Nous avons déjà signé plusieurs ententes avec des municipalités de tout le pays dans le cadre du Fonds pour accélérer la construction de logements. Merci, Sean. Ces ententes contribueront à réduire les formalités administratives et accroître l'offre de logements au Canada. We have been making tremendous progress with our Housing Accelerator Fund agreements with many of Canada's big cities. But we know that Canada's housing supply challenge extends beyond our major urban centres. That's why we've developed a plan to fast-track new housing construction in Canada's small towns and rural communities, and that's what Minister Fraser is going to talk about in a minute. Another major part of our plan is improving access to healthcare. Far too many Canadians in rural communities don't have access to the primary health care they need, and we know that provinces and territories need help attracting more doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners to the communities that need them the most. That is what Randy is going to talk about. Our government is working every day to deliver for Canadians across the country, from our big cities to our smallest towns. And the actions we're announcing today will help to ensure that Canada's small towns remain a great place to call home, today and for years to come. So thank you very much. And now, over to Sean.
Excellent. Merci, Chrystia. Merci, tout le monde. It's really wonderful to be here today. It's a particularly exciting opportunity to share some news today, just given that I come from a small town and grew up in a rural community. By way of update, we've now signed 36 agreements through the Housing Accelerator Fund that represents over 500,000 new units over the next decade or so. Disproportionately, the agreements that we signed have been in the largest cities in Canada. You'll have seen the agreements that we've reached with cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, Halifax, and a slew of others across the country. But it's important that we ensure that we continue to support housing growth in small towns and rural communities, like the one that I call home, right across Canada. There is an enormous opportunity in small town Canada and in rural communities to address the housing challenges. When we get it right, the quality of life that people get to enjoy is remarkable. We have communities across the country that are service centers with access to not only the services that people need, but the economic opportunities that will allow them to provide for their families and the infrastructure that already exists to allow people to build more homes. There are certain advantages that exist when you're seeking to build homes in small town communities as well. Generally speaking, the land value that drives up the cost of housing in larger urban centers is much more affordable in small town Canada. We also tend to see in different jurisdictions and in different parts of provinces that are more rural in nature, the cost of labor can be significantly less than what it can be in large urban centers. You can get a significant return on investment and get more bang for your buck in small towns and rural communities when it comes to home building, where you're dealing with centers where the infrastructure already exists. That said, this is not just a play that we need to make because you can get a good return on investment. There's intense need that's greater than has existed over the course of most of my life in communities like mine right across Canada. What we've seen over the course of the past few years is more people have chosen to move to small towns. We're seeing the cost of rent has gone up dramatically as vacancy rates get lower. We see that the cost of purchasing a home is far greater today than it was even just a few years ago. We need to respond in small towns and rural communities to serve the millions of Canadians who call those communities home. This is important because it's not only a sense of regional fairness, but we do have to address that need and address the specific challenges that rural communities raise with me in terms of accessing programs through CMHC and making sure that they actually are equipped to build out the houses that they need. Over the course of the next few weeks, we'll be rolling out more than 60 agreements with small towns and rural communities right across the country. The value of this cohort of agreements under the Housing Accelerator Fund is worth $176 million, and over the next decade represents more than 50,000 new homes across rural communities in Canada. The program has more flexibility for small towns and rural communities, recognizing the differences in capacity that may exist when you're dealing with a municipality that in some instances may only have a few municipal staff to prepare applications, a relaxed requirement on the number of initiatives that small communities need to put forward, a broader range of expenditures that are eligible under the fund. And we see a lot of communities coming up with very creative ideas that's going to help them build more homes over the course of the next number of years. We see that there are municipal land trusts being created for small communities. We're seeing new opportunities with modular housing, which is made possible in part because the land costs are much lower than in larger urban centers. There's unique proposals where small communities are seeking to address their entire housing need by supplementing the measures they're putting forward with a tiny home strategy in some instances. There's new supports being put in place to help some of these communities adopt modern and digital permitting processes so they can offer some of the fastest approval processes of any community in Canada. The creativity knows no bounds when it comes to the applications that we've received, and the difference that we expect to see is going to be extraordinary. Keep in mind, though, the total number of units in any given small town may seem small by comparison to the largest agreements we've signed with the big urban centers in Canada. A small number of homes in a community like mine, in rural communities, in small towns across Canada, can represent a significant portion of the housing stock that exists in an entire community. So this is an exciting day for me as a small town representative, and it communicates to communities like mine across Canada that we see the need and the opportunity in small towns and rural communities, and that every region of the country deserves the support. Very much looking forward to sharing details about the individual agreements in the weeks ahead, but in the meantime, I'm going to be spending a little bit more time in communities that look like the place that I come from, and look forward to sharing good news at a local level in the weeks to come. Thank you so much. With that, I'll share the floor with Randy.
Great. Thanks very much, Sean. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. I want to thank my colleagues for the invitation to be with you all today. You've just heard Minister Fraser, my colleague and friend, announcing more housing support for Canadians in rural communities. And whether Canadians live in the country and wherever they live in the country, they deserve to have access to the same level of government services as those in our biggest cities. And I represent one of the downtown cores of one of those big cities as the MP for Edmonton Centre. And despite that I represent an urban riding now, I grew up in rural Canada. I grew up in Warrenville. 2,000 people when I was growing up. It's now 10,000 people, and many of my family still live there, including my mom, Shirley. Et tous ceux qui sont nés et ont grandi dans une petite ville ou communauté comprennent pourquoi c'est important et les valeurs et l'expérience qu'on peut avoir avec cette réalité. And that reality for many Canadians living in rural and remote parts of Canada is that they're not able to access timely and reliable health care. Many are without a family doctor and they need to travel for hours, sometimes days, to get the basic care that they need. And during the pandemic, we saw how important it was to make sure that our health care workforce is, especially in rural and remote communities where the need was accentuated. These small Canadian communities deserve caring, qualified healthcare professionals who will give them the quality care that they need. Devenir un professionnel de la santé qualifié prend des années. C'est très difficile et c'est très coûteux. And that's why, already in place today, we want to shine a spotlight on the fact that we have increased student loan forgiveness for rural doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners by 50%. So what does it mean? So what that means is if you're a nurse or a nurse practitioner, it will save you up to $30,000. If you're a physician or a family medicine resident, it will save you up to $60,000. Over the next decade, increased loan forgiveness is expected to attract 1,200 new doctors and 4,000 new nurses to rural communities, like Sean's, and like my hometown. It's increasing the amount of forgivable loan amounts for doctors, nurses, not only makes the dream of many to practice in these incredible careers a reality, but will expand healthcare access to those that need it most. And providing more student loan debt relief will encourage more young people to become doctors and nurses to practice in underserved areas of our country or communities that have told us they have a hard time attracting new family doctors and nurses. Et cette aide financière s'inscrit dans le cadre d'autres investissements permanents visant à soutenir les travailleurs de la santé partout au pays. And there's more. We have also committed to expanding the reach of this program to benefit even more rural communities, including all communities with populations of up to 30,000 people later this fall. Almost 2 million Canadians have used federal student loans at some point in their life. And in 2022, thanks to the Minister of Finance and our government, we took the unprecedented decision to make all Canada student loans and Canada apprenticeship loans permanently interest-free. This saves students thousands of dollars over their lifetime. And this is in addition to the historic budget 23, where we outlined our plan to invest $46.2 billion in new funding for provinces and territories to improve health care for Canadians, totaling $191 billion over 10 years. Now, if you look outside of direct funding for healthcare, we're taking even more steps to strengthen the healthcare workforce. I was in Winnipeg earlier this year to announce the recognition of foreign credentials for 6,600 internationally educated healthcare professionals who already live here in our country, and they are trained professionals who have the skills to fill the labor gaps that we need in our economy and will strengthen our communities. So, from credential recognition to loan relief to billions more in health funding, our government will continue to strengthen Canada's world-class health system while relieving costs for hard-working middle-class families wherever you are in this country. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. And now,
And over to Gudie.
over to Gudie.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Randy. Friends, great to be here with you this morning. Bonjour tous. Friends, People, if you live in rural Canada, you have unique challenges. So I want to tell you a little bit about my riding. My colleagues have heard me say this a little bit. The landmass of my riding is bigger than Switzerland. I have over 200 beautiful, magical communities. But to put a little bit in perspective, there's only 2 Walmarts. Most of my communities just have hundreds of people in it. The largest community doesn't have 20,000 people. So practical speaking, it means my constituents and many folks who live in beautiful, small, remote, and indigenous communities have many distances to cover to access goods and services like medical care and unreliable service to high-speed internet. So according to the Canadian Health Workforce Network, more than 1 in 5 Canadians live in rural areas, but fewer than 10% of doctors work in rural areas. So what does that mean on the ground? So while Canada has an average of 1 doctor for every 450 people, it can be as low as 1 for every 3,000 people if you live in a small area. So it means people have to travel further and wait longer for medical attention. So ask anyone who lives in a smaller rural community, Sean knows, and Randy, and of course Chrystia grew up in a small community as well. They'll tell you how someone they know has to travel too long to visit the doctor or the nurse practitioner if they need health care. As Randy said, we expect over 3,000 doctors and nurse practitioners to take advantage of this loan forgiveness that Randy just spoke of. So Sean, that hospital you've got in Sheet Harbour and the hospital I've got in Norris Point, this is great news for them to be able to attract new doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners. So look, another solution to address rural healthcare is how do we access rural healthcare virtually? And over the last few years, provincial and territorial governments have worked hard to implement virtual care in a way to complement in-care person. And we're making sure that every Canadian has access to reliable, affordable, high-speed internet by 2030. Therefore, that will enable more folks to access care virtually. Through the Universal Broadband Fund, we've announced nearly 300 projects to connect families to high-speed internet. In 2023 alone, 40,000 households were connected, and work has begun on projects that will serve another 200,000 households. Friends, that's incredible. Connectivity shouldn't be a luxury, it's a necessity in today's world. And our progress is great. As you've heard me say many, many times, we're on track to exceed our goal of making sure that 98% of folks are connected by 2026. So stay tuned on that exact number in just a few months. This is going to make a real difference for folks in small, rural, and Indigenous communities. So it's mean less time traveling and the chance to get a faster diagnosis. So that's win-win for everyone. And if any of these doctors and nurses and nurse practitioners are parents, they won't have to look hard for childcare either. Because last Friday, together with the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador in my home province, we announced a 10% top-up for daycare operators in rural parts of our province to make sure that the providers have the help they need to make sure affordable and safe childcare is available. So far, 80 daycares in small communities are eligible in my province. And to speak briefly about housing, as Minister Fraser said, the housing crisis doesn't affect just big cities. Small and rural areas feel it the same, friends, and often they don't have the same infrastructure to support the development of new housing. And remember, rural communities are at the heart of what our government's vision is. The critical minerals strategy, our wind hydrogen growth, the tourism sector, the forest sector. Right now, rural Canada contributes just under 30% of the GDP to our country. Look out, Chrystia, because that number is going to go up. I'm home in Newfoundland and Labrador early next week to speak more about Sean's issue on housing. But what I can tell you is rural communities can expect help taking advantage of underused land and make sure we build for the future, because I know that we know climate change is real. Small communities and rural communities offer a wonderful quality of life. Easy access to the outdoors, neighbors who you know and they look out for each other, and stunning vistas. So if you haven't visited a rural community soon, pack your bags and get out there. The next steps we're taking today are going to make sure that these magical small communities stay that way. So thank you. Merci.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's time for questions. Be one question, one follow-up, and the ministers do have to get out by 9:50. So if both the questions and answers can be short, we can get as many questions through as possible. First question, Kate McKenna, CBC.
Question for Minister Fraser about the Federal Housing Advocates report calling for a national response to the crisis of encampments. Just what did you take away from that, and will you commit to establishing a national encampments response plan by August 31st?
So look, first of all, I want to thank the advocate for her report. I had the opportunity to connect briefly over the past few days to get a bit of a preview as to what the recommendations would include. We're working to develop the response to address encampments across Canada now. I had the opportunity recently to connect with some of the big city mayors across Canada. We are not just waking up to the enormous need to respond to this as a result of the advocate's report. This is something we've been working on over the last number of months and last number of years. You will have seen very recently an increase that Minister Freeland announced of $100 million to help support homelessness response efforts in communities across Canada. That was a decision we took before the holidays just to get money into the emergency response as cold weather started to set in. In addition, we can't assume that we can address the encampments challenges without also addressing the underlying affordable housing challenges. It's not enough to inject money into local responses unless there is a long-term plan to find sustainable housing options for the people who are living in encampments today. So the Housing Advocates Report appropriately shines a light on the immense need that communities are facing and the people who are currently unhoused. And we are working now to develop an appropriate response to help cities deal with encampments and as importantly, to find sustainable and durable housing solutions for the people who are living in them today.
Great. And my follow-up is for Minister Boissonnault on loan forgiveness. We've heard that finances are a barrier for some, but we've also heard that what's really affecting doctor supply is the number of medical residency spots, which have been stagnant for a decade. Why don't you use this money to actually expand the number of residences to train more doctors?
It's a really great question, and part of that is the partnership that you see us rolling out across the country with the $191 billion in healthcare. So medical residencies are a unique part of the system governed by the provinces and the colleges of physicians and surgeons and medical schools. And so if we want to talk about having more spaces for more docs, that's a question that I would ask you to ask Premier Ford and Premier Smith in my own home province. The money's there, and the provinces and the universities can allocate it, and it should allocate it in these spaces. But at the same time, it's not just about more medical residencies and more medical spaces. It's about recognizing the medical professionals who are already here. And I'm the minister that has the hammer for federal credential recognition. And yet all of the power to actually do that work lies with the provinces. And so when I met with my federal, provincial, territorial counterparts in Winnipeg in January, it was a very clear message that those jurisdictions that take down those barriers faster will actually have the people flow to those jurisdictions. And take a look at what's happened in Saskatchewan. They've actually passed legislation. They've put the guilds on notice and said, if you don't open it up, we're going to come in and show you how to regulate these professions. They haven't had to do that, but they've created an actual unit inside the Saskatchewan government that if you have a credential in this country, it gets recognized within 20 days, or you get a pathway for it to be recognized. And if you have a foreign credential, it's a 50-day response from the government with a pathway to have that credential recognized. An example from Alberta. Because in one of our recent budgets, Minister Freeland put a note there that said, if the provinces don't get busy in this space, we're going to put in a national credential for healthcare certification. Alberta scoped in 13 countries for nurses. They expected 200 to 300 people to apply. 1,700 people applied. They got 1,000 nurses out of that, and the other 700 are now on a pathway to becoming nurses in Alberta. So I need the whole system to work. We as a country need the whole system to work, from universities, colleges, medical residencies, all the way to foreign credential recognition. And we'll keep doing our part on making sure that it's more affordable to take these jobs.
If I can just offer a 30-second supplement to that question. The measure that Minister Boissonnault's shared today is not just about having a greater number total of physicians and healthcare workers working in Canada. It's also about where they work. I can tell you, as somebody who represents rural communities, the enormous impact of a doctor shortage and nursing shortage in communities is costing people lives. There are emergency rooms at hospitals in my constituency in Sheet Harbour, Middle Musquodoboit, Musquodoboit Harbour, who have scheduled openings for the ER because there's no doctor every day who works in these facilities. The change that Randy has just announced is going to render the hospitals in those communities eligible the same way other communities are for student loan forgiveness. I can tell you that the incentive that it's going to create when you can put your hand up and say, we can forgive $60,000 off your student loan to a new doctor who's thinking about where they want to practice, that's going to pull more doctors to these communities, and you'll less often drive by a sign that tells you when the ER is going to be open. It is unconscionable to me in Canada that we live with communities that more or less tell people that they should schedule when they're going to experience an emergency. That isn't how life works. We need to make sure that every community in Canada has access to health care where it's needed and when it's needed, and the change that he's made today is going to ensure equity in access to health care in rural Canada. This is a monumental policy shift, and it's going to make a very big difference for the communities that I represent.
Okay, if you're not sure that I've seen you, raise your hand again. But next question goes to Steve Scherer, Reuters.
Good morning. This is a question for Minister Freeland. Yesterday, the EU adopted a law to set aside windfall profits made on frozen Russian central bank assets, which is considered a step toward taking the other central bank assets and using them to help reconstruct Ukraine. I was wondering, do you think, I know that most ministers should see each other later this month at the WTO meetings in Abu Dhabi. Do you think that there might be a more general decision on seizing or confiscating the Russian assets by then? And what might it look like? Is it going to be collateral or is it going to be directly confiscated and liquidated to help Ukraine?
Well, thank you for the question. And it does give me an opportunity to thank our partners in the EU for their really important action. One of the things that I think has surprised a lot of people, particularly Vladimir Putin, is the extent to which the alliance of the democracies of the non-geographic West has really held together. And that we are working together to continue to support Ukraine because we recognize how important Ukraine's victory is for all of us. That was a really important step the EU took. Canada believes in the principle that the aggressor should pay. Russia has done tremendous damage to Ukraine, continues to do tremendous damage to Ukraine. It's going to cost a lot of money to rebuild, and we think it is absolutely appropriate for the aggressor to pay for that damage. As you know very well, Steve, Canada took a lead from the moment of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have really set a standard for legislation permitting the seizure and the confiscation of Russian assets. We work very closely with our partners in the US, in the EU, with Japan. This is an important measure that the EU has taken. Canada thinks that we need to go further, and we're going to keep working with our partners on that.
Okay, to stay on the Ukraine theme, I know some members of the government got this question yesterday, but I wanted to ask you, U.S. presidential candidate Trump suggested that if he becomes president, he will, he invited Russia to attack NATO countries that weren't paying 2% of GDP in military spending. That would include Canada. I just wanted to ask if you fear that the election of Donald Trump would spell the end of NATO.
So I'll say two things. First of all, the core principle of NATO is an attack on one country is an attack on all. That's what makes the alliance so powerful, and that's why that alliance has protected all of us since it was first founded. It's incredibly important to be clear in the world today where we are seeing countries like Russia trampling all over international law, for all NATO allies to be very, very clear that that core principle of Article 5 holds. And Canada is very clear on that. And in fact, as you know, we're leading the battle group Enhanced Forward Presence in Latvia. Beyond that, I'll just say that it's up to the American people to choose their leader. And a core responsibility of any Canadian government is to work effectively and in pursuit and defense of the national interest. with whoever the American people choose to lead them. That's something our government has done in the past. It's something that we're doing today, and it's something that we are absolutely prepared to do in the future. And I have just a tremendous amount of confidence in the strengths Canada brings to our position in the world.
Valérie Gamache, Radio-Canada.
Ministre Fraser, je voudrais vous entendre sur le défenseur du logement. Elle vous réclame un plan d'ici août prochain. Est-ce qu'il y a des politiques dans les boîtes? Est-ce qu'il y a déjà quelque chose de prêt? Et avez-vous des cibles pour réduire le nombre de campements d'itinérants?
Oui, merci. Et je veux remercier d'avocats. Défenseur, OK. Je suis un avocat dans ma carrière. Mais c'est très important de travailler ensemble pour adresser les plus grands défis pour des personnes qui n'ont pas du logement. C'est difficile parce que partout dans notre pays, il y a un problème dans des cités et les petites villes aussi. Nous avons besoin de travailler avec des municipalités, des provinces pour adresser ces concerns. Right now, we are working with big city mayors in particular. I had an opportunity to discuss this issue with the head of FCM yesterday, and we are not waiting for a perfect plan to roll out the supports that we know will make a difference today. As I referred to in a previous response, that's why we made the decision before the holidays to increase funding through the Reaching Home program by $100 million. It's why we continue to put measures in place, such as the Fall Economic Statement that recapitalized our affordable housing fund to the tune of an additional $1 billion. We are working specifically to identify the strategy to address concerns around encampments, but not just to push money towards cities that have them, but to actually work together with those communities to develop a strategy that will transition people from encampments to a more sustainable and durable housing solution. It can be challenging because the solution in Halifax may be different than the solution in Toronto, may be different than the solution in Edmonton. We need to work with communities right across the country to identify those local solutions to a common challenge, but we can't assume that just bringing encampments to an end is the end of the story. We need to ensure that on the back end of that effort that we build out enough affordable housing stock with community providers to ensure that people have lasting solutions and that we don't simply kick the can down the road a season or two. We want to solve this problem. We want to solve it permanently, and it's going to take all of us working together at every level of government to do so, and we're going to work towards establishing a response that I hope will satisfy the advocates' recommendations.
Et Madame Freeland, Monsieur Singh, la semaine dernière, vous a lancé une espèce d'ultimatum en disant ben on n'appuiera pas nécessairement l'énoncé économique, le projet de loi sur l'énoncé économique, si on n'arrive pas à une entente sur l'assurance médicaments avant le 1er mars. Est-ce qu'il y a eu des rencontres, est-ce qu'il y a eu des travaux qui ont été faits avec le NPD depuis, et est-ce que vous êtes toujours confiante peut-être d'en arriver à une entente avec eux d'ici le 1er mars?
OK, merci pour la question, et je voudrais juste ajouter une phrase à la réponse de Sean, juste pour dire qu'en ce qui concerne l'itinérance et le logement en général, comme Sean a dit au début, nous comprenons qu'en bout de ligne, on a un manque de logement au Canada et notre devoir, c'est de construire. Construire, construire, construire. Et ça fait une partie de la solution à tous les problèmes liés au logement. Concernant votre question, notre collègue, le ministre Holland, fait du travail acharné sur cette question. Il a plusieurs de rencontres et oui, on est confiante qu'on trouvera une solution.
Okay, we've got 5 people on the list, 6 minutes left, unless we can stretch it a little. Mike Le Couture, CTV.
It's a question for Minister Hutchings. In an interview on Question Period on CTV last fall, you suggested that Western Canadians need to elect more Liberals to get carbon tax relief. Do you still believe that?
Thanks for the question, Mike. Look, I believe that we represent all Canadians wherever you live, from coast to coast to coast. I'm proud of the work that I do to represent small communities, and I'm proud of the work that we do to bring the awareness of rural and remote communities like we are today in housing and healthcare. And I'll continue to do that, especially when it comes to issues that are going to help with affordability, because affordability is an issue key for everyone, no matter where you live. And the measures that we're announcing today, the measures that we have in there for Canadians, are there to help with the affordability issue.
I'll just sort of combine my follow-up. So do you regret saying that, A? And B, what's your message to Western Canadians who maybe took from that response that the federal government won't act in their interest unless they have Liberals representing them?
I think you've seen today that we do represent Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and rural Albertans get the rural top-up in the climate action incentive. So we do represent Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and I'm proud to be the minister of that. Matter of fact, I'm traveling out west in the coming weeks and to talk about more initiatives and more things that we're going to be doing for rural Canadians.
Mike, as the Alberta minister, I'm going to chime in here and say that our government in our first mandate delivered more infrastructure dollars to rural and urban communities just in Alberta than the entire 10 years that Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. Now that we're in this part of our mandate, I can be very clear that we bought a pipeline. It starts just out the outskirts of Edmonton, goes all the way to Burnaby. And that gave my colleagues in ridings across the country some heartache, and we did it because it was in the right interests of Western Canadians and the country as a whole. Air Products, $1.4 billion announcement that's going to create the first net zero hydrogen plant in North America in the north of my riding. Heidelberg Materials is going to produce the first net zero cement plant. Think about that, cement with net zero cement being produced on the west side of Edmonton. And just recently, Deputy Prime Minister and myself and the Premier and Francois-Philippe Champagne, all in the industrial heartland of Alberta, announcing Dow's investment of over $12 billion, of which we contributed to that point. So Sean has invested billions in my city and my province. Our industrial strategy to make sure that we are part of the 21st century economy has workers in the Alberta heartland as part of that. And we are making investments in our cities every single day. So do Liberals defend the West? Absolutely. Will this government continue to deliver for Western Canadians? You bet we will.
And I can't resist. I just have to say one sentence super fast. Okay, that Dow investment is historic. It was just north of Edmonton. That is a major investment in Edmonton's industrial heartland, and we're really proud of it. It is also no accident that the first two investments announced by the Canada Growth Fund were investments in Alberta companies. The fact is that Alberta is very much at the heart of the Canadian economy. We need a strong Alberta. We know that, and that's why we're investing in Alberta.
Mackenzie Gray, Global.
Hi, Ms. Freeland. Last week, the Prime Minister had a very passionate response about the Bell layoffs. He said it was a garbage decision from a company that should know better. I assume the budget is around the corner, and you'll know that Bell gets lots of tax credits and other breaks from the federal government in a federally regulated industry. Are you willing to remove Bell's eligibility in that to show the federal government's displeasure with what happened?
So everyone sitting in front of me and one of the people sitting here is a journalist. I used to be a journalist. It is heartbreaking for me as a journalist and now as an elected leader to see that announcement. And it's heartbreaking because Canadian journalism is foundational for Canadian democracy. We can only be a country that works if we have you guys telling our stories, holding our feet to the fire. And we need you to do it across the country, from coast to coast to coast. We can't have news deserts. You have seen from our government a commitment to journalism, a commitment to communities across the country, in big cities and in small towns. democracy has to happen everywhere. And we are definitely looking at ways going forward that we can support journalism and journalists across the country. I don't have anything to announce there, but it's so important.
Bell's one of Canada's largest companies. They laid off 9% of their workforce on the same day they raised their dividend for the 20th straight year. Do you think that's an ethical way to do business for one of Canada's biggest companies?
I do want to come back to journalists and journalism. For me, that is at the heart of this issue. The work that journalists do, telling our stories, telling Canada's story in this challenging world, is absolutely essential. We cannot be a functional democracy without it. And Canada is huge and vast, and we need journalists across the country. Look, you guys know this. It is a very tough time for journalism. We recognize that, and we're going to be there to support journalists and journalism. And then the other thing I'll say is this. We need companies in Canada who are investing in Canada and in Canadians. At our press conference last week, one of you asked me about productivity and the need for more investment in Canada. I believe we need more investment. The government is doing a lot to drive investment. I talked about the Canada Growth Fund and the really important work it's doing to fill some of the gaps and to encourage, to crowd in private sector investment to the green transition. But I am going to take the opportunity your question affords me to say to Canadian CEOs, we believe in you. We want strong Canadian headquartered companies in this country. And we need you to believe in Canada. And we need you to be investing in the productive capacity of this country, whatever sector you're in. And yeah, I would like to see a lot more of that.
If we can squeeze in one last question before the ministers have to get on their way. Laura Dillon, Bloomberg.
Just for Minister Freeland, how much fiscal room do we realistically have to introduce a new pharmacare program this year? You know, most estimates have put it at many billions of dollars, and this is coming at a time when you're trying to avoid juicing inflation and trying to allow the Bank of Canada to cut rates. So what size of that program could we see, and what increase to the deficit would you allow?
Okay, that is an excellent question. And you have included in your question are key fiscal and economic considerations. We've been talking today about housing, and we've been talking today about student loans. And for anyone looking for a house or an apartment, or anyone looking to pay off a student loan, one of the first things they think about is interest rates. So we definitely are conscious as our priority when it comes to economic policy of acting in such a way that creates conditions that will make it possible for interest rates to come down. So that is very much at the forefront. When it comes to the fiscal space, I don't have any numbers to report today. You'll see those in the budget. But we offered some specifics in the fall economic statement. When it came to our fiscal objectives in the immediate years, in this year and in the coming years. That was very intentional, and we intend to hit those targets.
Oh, thank you so much. So for Freeland and Minister Fraser, are you concerned at all that there seems to be sort of pent-up demand in the housing market that is just sort of prepared to be unleashed once the Bank of Canada signals it's ready to start cutting rates, and that we will see housing prices go up this year in the spring?
I'll start and then maybe Sean wants to add something. We know there is a lot of demand in Canada for housing. We recognize, and the heart of our housing strategy is a recognition that we need to build more homes faster, that supply is at the heart of the challenge, and that's why you see us here every week, really every day, announcing new plans to increase the supply of homes in Canada, whether it is purpose-built rental, new homes for people to buy, affordable housing. And so, you know, from our perspective, the central challenge is get more homes built faster for Canadians. We're a growing country. We need more homes.
Certainly, and you flagged the issue of pent-up demand with people who may be waiting for lower interest rates. Don't ignore the impact that interest rates have on restricting supply as well. My expectation is if we see a dip in interest rates over the course of this year, a lot of the developers that I've spoken to will start those projects that are marginal today, but will actually pencil out 6 months from now if interest rates were to take a dip. And I don't want to assume that's going to happen, but should that fact pattern come to pass, it doesn't change the mission for us. To Minister Freeland's point, regardless of whether interest rates remain where they are, come down a quarter point or half point, whatever may happen, the course of action remains the same because we know we need to build millions of homes. We need to make the math work for builders by getting rid of the GST, recapitalizing the Canada Mortgage Bond Program, putting low-cost financing through the Apartment Construction Loan Program into the system. We need to make it easier to build at a municipal level by ensuring that we're getting bang for our buck on the infrastructure investments that we make and putting incentives to reduce red tape. We need to invest in affordable housing. We need to grow the capacity of the workforce to build the homes necessary. Regardless of where the rate of interest sits today or 6 months from now, the actions that we take today are going to be identical. We need to do everything we can as quick as we can to build as many homes as we can, and that's going to be true today and 6 months from now, regardless of what may happen in the interest rate environment that we're dealing with.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Thank you.